Hello and welcome to the National World War II Museum's podcast series, Service on Celluloid. This is our mini-episode where I will answer comments and questions from the previous episode, as well as provide you, the listener, with oral histories from those who were there. My name is Seth Paradin, historian and digital content manager here at the National World War II Museum in New Orleans, and today we'll be continuing our discussion on the 2014 film Fury. Fury was written and directed by David Ayer. It stars Brad Pitt as Don Collier, Shia LaBeouf as Bible Swan, Logan Lerman as Norman Ellison, Michael Pena as Gordo Garcia, and John Bernthal as Grady Travis. Lauded for its gritty depiction of a part of World War II that is not frequently shown, that of the Armored Division, the film is considered a box office success, bringing in over $211 million.
And that tank itself is frightening enough, unless you're in it. If you're in it, you're scared to death. You're scared to hell, because I've been inside them too. You don't know whether you're built outside than inside. Inside you can't run. The infantryman, at least, he's got his own legs on them.
That was J.J. Whitmire, who you may have heard from the mini-episode for The Best Years of Our Lives, which was our second episode. J.J.'s a rock star here in our collection, and he, as an infantryman, he saw a great deal of the war. And not so odd, he actually got to see several aspects of the war, not just infantry combat, but armored combat as well, because as most historians will know, infantry was usually supported by armor, and armor was usually supported by infantry. And J.J. had multiple opportunities to not only see the inside of a tank, but be in the inside of a tank during some armored conflicts. One of the topics we discussed last week was the difference between the U.S. main battle tank, which was the Sherman, and the German tanks, of which there were several varieties, but three real main ones. The Mark IV, the Mark V, otherwise known as the Panther, and the fearsome Mark VI, better known as the Tiger. Now, the differences between the U.S. tanks and the German tanks were many, not the least of which was the thickness of the armor and the velocity and potency of the main weapon. Our curator, Josh Schick, expertly described that in the main episode, and I have to applaud him for that because that was really, really good. German tanks were simply better than American tanks, and that's a fact. That's not an opinion. That's a fact. And for many reasons, not the least of which was what I just said. But as I stated in the main episode, the Mark IV, which was the main German battle tank of World War II, was more than a match for the Sherman. The velocity of the main weapon could easily knock out a Sherman, while the thickness of the later variant of Mark IV's armor was over 3.5 inches thick, making it a little more difficult for the Sherman to knock it out. That being said, the Sherman's gun could penetrate the Mark IV fairly reliably at 1,000 yards, but once the Sherman met the Mark V, and of course the Tiger, all that went through the window. The sloped armor of the Panther tank, the Mark V, easily deflected the Sherman's 75 and 76 millimeter rounds, while the thick 4 inches of frontal armor on the Tiger made it absolutely impervious to anything that the Shermans could throw at it. One Sherman veteran described shooting at Tigers like throwing tennis balls against a wall. Everything just ricocheted right off of it every single time. The Tiger's fearsome and deadly 88 millimeter main gun made it a monster on the battlefield. It was something that was absolutely feared by anybody who came across it, and rightfully so. Such was the fear of the Tiger by Sherman crews, both American and British and Canadian, that every German tank became a Tiger tank in their eyes. If you actually take every quote by Allied tankers and count how many times they saw a quote Tiger, Germany wished they could have produced so many Tigers. They probably would have stopped the invasion, but it was such a fearsome weapon that every single thing that they saw with tracks on it was a Tiger tank, and every single weapon that was shot at them became an 88, and of course it wasn't. But if you combine those two, the Tiger tank and the 88, it was just an absolute beast, and it's something that we see in the movie. And for better or worse, as we discussed in the main episode, there's some things in the Tiger scene that are accurate, and there's some things that are inaccurate. But taking on a Tiger in a one-on-one battle was virtual suicide for the crew of a Sherman. You didn't do it unless you absolutely had to. More often than not, the Sherman would kick it in reverse and get out of there as fast as they could. What the Americans and the Brits and the Canadians did have over the Tigers was numbers. I don't know off the top of my head how many Tigers there were in Normandy. I know that number's out there, and I'm sure somebody will be more than happy to tell us. But I don't know off the top of my head. But regardless of that, we had vast numbers of Sherman tanks, and there is strength in numbers, obviously. And what the Allied tankers would do when encountering a Tiger tank, and a Panther tank too, but more often than not a Tiger, is they would surround it. And as they show in the movie, shooting a Tiger in the rear, where the armor is the thinnest, was the easiest and most reliable way to knock it out. It would set the engine on fire. And once that engine's on fire, it's over with. That tank is gone. Whether the crew is killed or not, the tank is destroyed, and that renders it useless. Methods for knocking out these steel behemoths were developed in the field by the tankers themselves. One of those tankers was a man named John Rogers. John served as a company commander in Easy Company, 67th Armored Regiment of the 2nd Armored Division. He entered the European theater in mid-June 1944, just a couple of weeks after the D-Day invasion, as a replacement officer. John recalled that the first tank he was assigned to was one that had been patched up after having been knocked out previously. Even though the tank had been repaired and cleaned by the tank recovery unit, the inside of the tank was still stained by the blood of its former occupants. Nevertheless, John took command of Easy Company in June of 44, and he successfully led them through the remainder of the war. In the clip we're about to hear, he recalls how he and his tankers would attack the fearsome Tiger when they met them in Normandy.
Well, they really didn't tell me anything about it. We knew that it was really more maneuverable and faster than the Tigers and the other German tanks. We did know that. And the ability of it to maneuver quickly and get out of range or surround them, as we wound up doing about every time. And they couldn't cope with that because they were so slow. They were huge and had the 88s, but they were slow. And of course, the way we combated them with our Shermans, the way I did, and the way we wound up doing it all the time, even as a corps or as a division, outflank them on both sides, left and right. And then I would go with the 3rd Battalion, the 3rd platoon, right toward the Tiger. And they would stay there a little bit, and then they'd see they were surrounded, and they'd back off a little bit, and then they'd try to maneuver and turn around and head back. And when we did that, we fired our 76s and 75s into them and set the engine compartment on fire. And that turned out to be the way we really operated from then on through the war. And even that, like I say, as a company, as a battalion, as a division, a lot of our destruction of the Tigers and the German army period was just outflanking them because we had more vehicles. And we had another good thing. We'd lose tanks, but within a lot of times within 35 minutes, we'd have replacement tanks come right up to us, replace what we lost.
Wow.
And that was great. You couldn't beat that because that kept you mobile and ready to go.
One thing that Fury does very well is portray the feelings of the American Army towards their German enemy in late 1945. The hatred for the enemy is something usually seen in movies about the Pacific Theater when the Marine Corps and the Army faced the Japanese, and that was certainly true. That was certainly there. But it was just as nasty and real in the European theater, especially late war, when it was obvious that the war was over and that the Germans kept on fighting. One of the lines in the movie is, I think it's Jason Isaacs says to Brad Pitt, he says, "Why don't they just quit?" And Brad Pitt replies, he says, "Would you?" And that was a common thought among the GIs, be they armored or infantry or even Army Air Forces, is that these guys knew that they were beaten, yet they kept on fighting. And a lot of American soldiers and British and Canadians, I'm sure as well, felt that when somebody was killed or seriously wounded, that it was useless because the war was over. Why didn't you just give up and let's all go home? In Fury, the Americans truly hate their enemy. And I would say that this is accurate for that time. As I said, the GIs wanted the war to end. They knew it was essentially over, yet the Germans kept fighting. The fact that the GIs ran into concentration camps and encountered fanatical Hitler-Jugend child defenders, as shown in the movie. They didn't show the concentration camps, obviously, but they did show the HJ fighting the GIs. Only made the GIs hate their beaten enemy even more. The movie portrays a visceral hatred for the Waffen-SS. And while it may be a bit over the top, and it is, and overly accentuated in the movie, and it is, that hatred, again, was real. Maybe not quite as visceral as it is in the movie, but it was real. The GIs were, by this time, April 45, were fully aware who ran the concentration camps that they'd run across. They did not differentiate between the Allgemeine SS, who did run the camps, and the Waffen-SS. All they saw were the Zig runes on the collars and the skulls on their helmets, or not their helmets, their officers' caps, and they knew who those guys were, and they were going to die. They knew that quite often anyone who was taken prisoner by the SS were not treated well, to say the least. And all that played into that hatred. The American GI in 1945 was fully aware who committed the Malmedy massacre, which of course was the Waffen-SS. I do have to be abundantly clear here and say that there was an unwritten rule for the Americans, specifically, to not take Waffen-SS or Fallschirmjäger prisoners that dated all the way back before the Normandy invasion. Airborne troops were specifically told, don't take prisoners, and they didn't, or at least not very often. And so there's always two sides to every story here, and there was certainly no love for the SS, and the SS had no love for their enemies either. It was a two-way street. As the GIs pushed further into Germany, they ran into more and more civilians too. Some friendly, most of them not so friendly. The GIs learned quick that this wasn't like France, Belgium, or Holland, where the civilians were happy to see them in those countries. The German civilians, more often than not, were not happy to see them. The civilians in Germany had to be treated differently than those in the aforementioned countries, and every civilian posed a threat. The GIs knew this and saw this firsthand when boys as young as 10, and sometimes younger, popped out of doorways with Panzerfausts and knocked out their tanks and burned up their buddies at close range. Children became targets for the sheer self-preservation instinct that lies in all of us. Having to kill so-called non-combatants weighed on the minds of those doing the killing. One of those men was Robert Christie. Robert was a graduate of Norwich University, and he enlisted in the Army in early 1942. He was called to active duty in 43, took his basic training, and shipped out to the ETO in the fall of 1944. He arrived in theater as a replacement officer and was assigned as a tank commander in Easy Company, 33rd Armored Regiment of the 3rd Armored Division, just days after the beginning of the Battle of the Bulge, in December 44. Robert saw heavy combat action as the 3rd Armored pushed through the Bulge and attacked units of Kampfgruppe Piper, Waffen-SS, at Stumaun and La Glaise in December and pushed deep into Germany through 1945. He vividly recalled the close-quarter combat between tanks and the enemy inside many German towns and cities until the end of hostilities. After the war, he wrote a poem entitled The Hunter, and that summed up his feelings fighting a defeated enemy who was constantly dangerous in his homeland and the ferocity of that late war combat.
This last poem expresses a feeling of guilt I have had since returning from the war, long after. I finally realized I was experiencing what theologian Martin Buber has characterized as existential guilt, that is, guilt related to harm actually done to others. The poem arose out of somewhere deep in memory some 50 years later. I'm not a hunter, I am a killer. Once you have killed, you are a killer, not a hunter. I hunted bullfrogs with a BB gun. I got him. I once shot at a dragonfly in flight, a big one, nailed him. The U.S. Army gave me a Garand, government issue M1. I was a good shot. Expert marksman, the medal said. Then they gave me the 76 millimeter cannon and 3 machine guns attached to Fate's Finger, medium tank, and M4A3. I hunted people with it. Some I never saw. Shot them with HEs, high explosive shells, in houses in bleak wrecked towns 2,000 yards away. Women, kids, old people, enemy soldiers, Who knows? They could never lay it on me. 2,000 yards away, right? I hunted big cats, panthers, tigers, and panthers, while they were hunting me. The hunter-killer game. I got all of them first. APs, armor piercing. Expert marksman, right? Wrong. Lucky bastard. I'm not a hunter. I'm a killer. I always will be. I was only a hunter until that first frog. Now I hunt only for truth. I can't kill that.
So that was Robert Christie's poem, The Hunter. It's fascinating, really. He wrote that many, many years after the war, and he even admits in the oral history later in the oral history that he was dealing with what he thought was post-traumatic stress when he wrote that, and I think it's fairly obvious when you hear it. But I think it's beautiful, and it's very, very powerful, and it reflects pretty accurately the situation faced by those guys in 1945 and the types of combat that they fought and the places that they fought and the things that they saw. One thing in the movie that we really didn't get a chance to talk about, and I'll address it here, and one thing that I thought was very accurate was really at the beginning, or relatively close to the beginning of the movie, and that's when Fury leaves the battlefield at the beginning of the movie, which what battle that is, God knows. It's, looks like something from Dante's Inferno, and nothing like that happened on the Western Front, but that's besides the point. They roll into a camp, a bivouac area, a rear area, and the things you see, and if you've seen this movie, I highly suggest you go back and you rewatch this scene because it's really, really accurate. I think it's a combination of several scenes or several things, and they tried to put it all into one scene, which may not be 100% accurate, but a lot of the things that they show in there are very, very true. It's a filthy area. It's mud everywhere, and just it's gross. There's a field hospital there where there's, it kind of looks like a Civil War field hospital where there's like severed legs and feet and arms and things. And while that may be a little bit over the top because, sanitary conditions were a little bit more, a little better in World War II than they were in 1864. Some of the other things that they show in that scene are very, very accurate. Like they have the German prisoners of war in what I would call a stockade, but it's a cage, and there's just a ton of guys in there, and they're just standing there with no cover, and a barbed wire fence and a machine gun pointing at them, and that's very true. We like to have the vision of German prisoners of war here in the United States enjoying a good life, and they did. But the ones that were captured in the European theater in the Western Front in 1944 and 45, they didn't have the time to ship them back to the United States, and they were kept in open air cages like that with no cover. And that's something that the movie shows, and it is very, very accurate. Another thing they show in there is the exhaustion of these guys, and it's not just the guys in Fury, although when the tank rolls into the camp, I think John Bernthal is sleeping, if I remember correctly, on the top of the tank as it's rolling in. And that's something, too, that I think Fury does very well, is that they show that it was just a constant brain-body draining event. It was something that was just constant. You were constantly exhausted, always tired. And even if you got, quote, rest, unquote, you were still exhausted when you woke up because these guys went 24 hours a day. And that's something that they really show very well. I think another aspect of that bivouac scene that they show that's very true is the fresh-faced lieutenant, and that's the guy that we see that gets burned up in the tank by the Hitler Youth. In the first real combat scene of the movie when his tank gets hit by a Panzerfaust. This guy's fresh. His uniform is green. It's beautiful. It's pressed. I think one of the sergeants, asked him, when was the last time you shaved, or have you ever shaved, or something like that. This guy, he's an 18-year-old lieutenant telling 22 and 23-year-old sergeants how to run the war. And in 1945, that's pretty accurate. The officer corps in the United States Army and the infantry and armored units had taken a heavy toll in casualties. And they were taking people who were still in college at the ASTP programs. advanced specialized training programs and throwing them directly into the infantry. Some of them were officers, some of them were grunts, and some of them were, privates and PFCs and corporals. But to have that young 18-year-old as a, quote, leader of men was very accurate for 1945. And the way that the sergeants reacted to him, you got Brad Pitt and these other guys who'd seen a load of combat, was also very accurate. Regardless of his rank, and he's an officer and you're supposed to respect your officer, these sergeants were like, look, we know how this works. And sergeants ran the Army. And that was true, in the Revolutionary War, and it's true now. The sergeants run the Army, especially the infantry and armored units. And everyone knows that. They knew that then, they know that now. So, as I said in the main episode, armored combat is not something that you see in a lot of movies. And in my opinion, this is what makes Fury important in my eyes. The only other movie that I can think where they show a lot of armored, quote, combat, unquote, is Kelly's Heroes, which is a fantastically awesome movie. And we will do a review of that sooner or later. That movie's great, but that's a completely different theme. But it's a forgotten subject, really. I mean, when you see a lot of World War II, when you see most World War II movies, it's about the foot soldier, which rightfully so. But armored combat was nasty. It was gritty. It was dirty. It was violent. It was bloody. It was gory. And it's something that a lot of people don't think about, and it's something that Hollywood really doesn't touch on. And I applaud the makers of Fury for doing it, because they did show an aspect of World War II, especially for the United States, that is not shown very often. And usually when it is shown, it's not shown very well. And I think a lot of the things that this movie tackled were both accurate and well done. It's worth a view if you've never seen it, for the reason that you can take a sneak peek, if you will, inside the world of the tanker fighting in Germany in 1945. We hope you've been enjoying listening to these episodes as much as we've enjoyed making them. With that being said, we'll be taking a 2-week hiatus as we produce some more shows for next season. We'll return on the week of September 24th when we review and critique the classic The Great Escape. In the meantime, if you have any questions or comments from previous episodes, feel free to contact us through social media on Facebook, Instagram, or Twitter at Service on Celluloid. Thanks so much for listening. If you'd like to listen to the complete oral histories you heard today, please visit our digital collections at www.2online.org. That's www.2online.org. I'd like to thank everyone who made this podcast possible, our producer, Tessa Jager, and our sound engineer, Jeremy Burson. This has been a production of the National World War II Museum.